Hey, and welcome to Conversations on the Commission, a podcast covering the topics, trends, and issues in missions that impact both the missionary and the churches that partner with them. And by the way, we do say co-mission on purpose. And the reason for that is this podcast is all about co-laboring and the labor that takes place between the missionary and the local church, and in our scenario, with the mission board as well. My name is Tony Bulawa.
And hello there, I am Stephen Maldoff. And Tony, today I think we're going to talk about a topic that really is kind of in the vernacular of society right now. There is a word that's been used quite often, pretty negatively, I must say, because of everything that's happened with the pandemic and the impacts of that. And that is the word furlough. Right now, when people think of the word furlough, they're usually thinking getting furloughed from a job, things of that nature. So it does not have a good connotation. People don't want to be furloughed.
I've got a family member right now who's furloughed from their job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Furlough is a word that missionaries are quite often used to. I mean, that's been in the vernacular for missionaries for a long time, because the standard, I guess, kind of thing that missionaries do would be serve overseas for a while, come back and take a furlough.
Right.
But I think we have to kind of define, what does furlough truly mean, kind of the dictionary definition of it,
Sure.
And then how does that apply to missions?
Yeah. Well, according to the dictionary, a furlough it's a leave of absence. And I think it's important to stress that it is a temporary leave of absence. So, like I mentioned, I've got family members who are furloughed from their job right now. They're not laid off. They're expecting to go back to their place of employment in the near future, hopefully. And the same is true with missionary work, that when that missionary serves a term on the field, they come back for, I don't know if we would want to call it a leave of absence, but a time where they return back home and carry out certain duties. It's supposed to be a time of relaxation as well, and we'll talk about that and whether it is or isn't. But it is important, I think, for people to understand that in the missionary vernacular, furlough is a time where the missionary comes off the field, returns back to his native country, and then returns with the purpose of returning to the work.
Yeah, exactly right. One of the things that sometimes people who don't understand truly what missions furlough is, and I understand why they don't understand it, because you take a situation of a pastor, and you think a pastor working for 4 years at his church, and all of a sudden announcing, guess what, folks, I'm going to take a year off.
Right.
Well, that would seem like an oddest thing to happen, but yet in kind of the mission cycle of life that's been going on for generations and decades, that would be the norm.
Right.
I guess the standard would be 4 years on the field, then come back off for maybe 1 year. There's a lot of things about that, but that would probably be the stereotypical furlough pattern that missionaries take. I guess first off, is that even biblical? Is this just one of those things that missionaries just are lazy, want a year vacation, and then go back to work? Where did we come up with this idea of furlough?
Right. Well, I think that first of all, and that's a great question, where did we come up with the idea? Since our first podcast, we've been trying to always refer back to the scriptures. But I do want to say, while it's fresh in my mind, furlough is not missionary vacation. And very seldom does it play out that way. That's something that should be at least mentioned. But there is a biblical principle, and I think precedence for missionary furloughs. And we find that in Acts chapter number 14. After Paul has been off on his first missionary journey, the Bible tells us in Acts 14 and in verse number 26 that they eventually returned to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they had fulfilled. in that particular place. Remember, Paul was planting churches, moving on, planting another church, leaving behind leadership, and doing it again. And so in that first journey, they had done that. And the Bible tells us in verse 27 that when they got to Antioch, they gathered the church together and they rehearsed all that God had done for them and how he had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And so there is definitely this idea of furlough where we come back. And, if a missionary has, the average missionary has probably somewhere around 60 or more supporting churches, and it's going to take, you think, 52 weeks in a year. That's a lot of meetings to fit in, even if they report to all their churches inside a year. That's why I say it's not vacation,
Right.
To go back and do that biblical reporting and rehearsing in the ears of the churches what God has done and reporting about fruit that's abounded to those churches' account.
I mean, little did Paul know that he was setting a pattern, really, for missionaries for the rest of the generations of church history. But it is a good pattern, and I think there's definitely some importance to it as far as the partnership between a missionary and the supporting church. Because just like what Paul did, he came back to his sending church, in a sense, of the church at Antioch, and he would go around and just tell everyone, look, let me break it down, what's been going on in this city and in this place. Let me tell you the testimony of this guy who came to Christ, and as I went over here to this Gentile city, the response that happened there when I brought the gospel.
Sure.
And the same thing is now with missionaries coming back from the field to the United States or to their national country and sharing with their supporting churches, this is what God has been doing over this period of time that we've had. I know it's supposed to be a time of excitement for both the missionary to be able to share the good news of what God's been doing, as well as excitement for the church to hear what God has been doing through that missionary they partner with.
Right. And people might say, well, they write prayer letters. Well, I think Paul wrote prayer letters as well. We might call them epistles, but I think some of those epistles were certain where he mentions the work he's been involved in to other churches, especially to the church at Philippi, where he mentions some things and refers to them as a supporting church. But I think nothing really compares to that face-to-face meeting where the missionary comes back and talks to the church and gives that report in person. And we're living through this time we just mentioned where people are furloughed and we're isolated one from another. I think that we all understand that as Christians, we crave fellowship. We crave to be with one another. And the online meetings, we thank God that we can do that. Thank God we have technology to do podcasts, but there's just nothing like meeting with people in person. And so it was important for Paul to do that. I think it's important for missionaries to do that today.
Yeah, absolutely. I know some people try to figure out ways on using technology to, let me communicate in through Skype or FaceTime or Zoom and to a church and just talk to them that way. But like you said, I think there's something just important for the life of the church to have missionaries in, and then also for the life of that missionary to be able to share. We just like always sharing good news.
Right.
I mean, we enjoy that, so I think there's something to that. I think also biblically, you see, even in probably best of my understanding of Scripture, the busiest time for the disciples. I mean, they were going out. Jesus kind of sent them on a campaign to go into towns and preach and do miracles and things like that. They come back all excited. They're, hey, Jesus, you wouldn't believe what we've seen this happen and we've seen that happen.
Right.
And right after that, then you have Jesus saying, hey, come and let's separate for a time of rest.
Right.
I can imagine the disciples like, yeah, we have earned this break. We've been traveling and walking and relying on the giving of people to care for them. And so now we just get to catch our breath and rest. Now, we know it didn't end up that way.
No.
And I think that's sort of what happens with furlough in real life for the disciples at that time. Ended up being that they ended up serving the feeding of the 5,000.
Right.
So they got actually even busier on that day.
Did.
But what happens to missionaries today? Because it is supposed to be a time of rest. I agree. But like you said earlier, it often is not a period of rest. So what does happen to the missionary? Why is it not rest?
Well, like we said, you think about the average number of churches a missionary has as supporting churches, and I think we can safely say that the average missionary out there probably has about 60 or so, maybe a little bit more even, supporting churches. Their desire is to get back and connect with those people, talk to them, let them know about what God has been doing. If you just simply do the math and think about that and think that if a furlough is a year long, and just getting back into the country, getting settled down, the couple of weeks it just takes to kind of get acclimated, get a place to live. Missionaries don't have a lot of times housing back in the States. They got to arrange that. They got to arrange for a car and all those kind of things. So that chews up a couple of weeks at the beginning, a couple of weeks at the end, wrapping things up. Now you got 60 churches you're trying to get to. Even if you could book a different church Sunday morning and then a different one Sunday night and a different one Wednesday, which sometimes is just not possible. Sometimes you're in a whole week's missions conference. I think that's part of the reason that furlough never becomes a time of rest for a missionary, but I do think it's important that the missionary sets some time aside on purpose to get some of that rest. And again, your point about what Jesus said to the disciples was so important. You better come apart, and we've heard it said, you come apart before you fall apart. And there really should be some structured time in there for family and just kind of recouping.
Of course, any one of us in any profession would love vacation time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when we talk about coming back from a foreign culture, really,
right,
that there is an adjustment period that does happen.
Mm-hmm.
Why does somebody leave their field, for a time? Well, let's just take something like I'm working Southeast Asia, and so let's just take a country like Indonesia. Okay, so you have a different culture, entirely different culture than the United States culture.
Right.
There is a density to that island, that there's people everywhere. I mean, to do normal business takes all day. You may only get one or two things done off your to-do list just because of the time it takes to get from point A to point B because of the traffic and the population density. And then you have spiritual oppression. I mean, again, using Indonesia as an example, it is a predominant Muslim nation, so you hear the call to prayer all the time. You see that influence in every aspect of life. So you are on a heightened spiritual kind of sensitivity of things,
Sure,
and you feel that oppression around you. And so when you take cultural bombardment, you take spiritual bombardment, you take the giving out often of all that you have, because a missionary, particularly in the beginning of the work, is doing all of it. I mean, they're doing the preaching and the teaching and the singing and the greeting and the setting up. They're doing everything. So they're going to be spent emotionally, spiritually, physically.
Yeah.
It is important, as you said, come apart before you fall apart.
Right.
And I think there is a necessity to furlough for a missionary, biblically and just practically for it.
I think so.
So let me ask you this. What can a church do to really help their missionary on furloughs? Churches like seeing their missionary when they're in. That's great.
Yeah.
So what are some things a church can do to help their missionary when they come back on furlough to make it an enjoyable time for them?
Yeah, I think number one is, it probably predates the furlough. It precedes the furlough. And what I mean by that is be familiar with what's already been going on. Your missionary has been sending you prayer letters. And so take the time to read those. I know in the church that I pastored, we would always read those to the congregation. But we also had those who always requested copies, and they'd take them home and read them. There's some things to pray over in there and that kind of stuff. And, a missionary can sense whether you're been aware of what's going on in the field or not just by the conversations they had. And for a missionary to come back to a church and members in the church say, hey, I read this in your prayer letter, you can't imagine the really how comforting, how encouraging that is to that missionary. Say, hey, somebody was really back here, really was praying, really did care. To use the words of William Carey, they were holding the ropes.
Absolutely. I remember very vividly a situation happened with me and my family when we came back on furlough. Now, we were a bit more unusual. We didn't come back for the first 10 years. We stayed out in Australia for 10 years. But when we did come back on that 10th year to the United States to visit our supporting churches, we have some churches out in the kind of the hollers of Tennessee, pastor's working full-time. There's no secretary. You don't get a hold of them during the week.
Right.
So we decided we're just going to show up on a Sunday morning, unannounced, just pop in, say hi to the church. That was it. Well, when we walked in, there was somebody who actually said, "Hey, you're the Maldoffs. You're our missionaries."
Yeah.
Now, we hadn't been there in 10 years, or probably over that, probably at least 12 years when we started deputation, So it's been 12 years since they've seen us. And to have that lady point us out and recognize us as their missionaries, that meant the world to me. I remember that vividly. I remember how I felt. I remember that encouragement because I knew she cared for us. She was aware of us. She was praying for us. She knew what we were doing for the Lord overseas.
Yeah.
Wow, I couldn't believe it, and I still, to this day.
What a great encouragement that is.
It was totally, very much so. All right, so I think that's great. What else? What can else a church do for a missionary?
I think another thing is that recognize that missionary on the foreign field probably has not had a lot of Christian fellowship during his or the family's term of service in that foreign field. They probably have maybe they are in a place like Indonesia that you mentioned, or in the far north where it's particularly hard to win people to the Lord Jesus Christ, and they don't have a lot of people around them, other missionaries, and so they haven't had a lot of fellowship. One of the things, again, that we did at our church is we had a missionary come in. We would always try to schedule and let the missionary know in advance so it would work in their schedule as well. But we would schedule just a very simple fellowship with the missionary and give the church a time to get around the missionary, talk with them, and hear the stories firsthand, not just from the platform, not just from the pulpit, but to interact with them. I know as a missionary, I enjoyed that. That was encouraging to me. I believe it was encouraging to the missionaries that we supported as a church. I know it was a help to our church family to interact with missionaries because, I really believe that missionaries and their zeal for the Lord is contagious, and it really helps people to say, hey, you know what? They're doing this for the Lord. And we're not saying that they're superheroes of the faith, but we all know that, you meet a missionary who's given 4 years of service overseas, and you think to yourself, maybe I could do a little bit more even here at home. And so it was a help all the way around. For me, as a pastor, it was a win-win-win. Church, pastor, and missionary all benefited.
Oh, absolutely. I think, one thing I've seen is if that church gets excited about that missionary coming, there are two attitudes. You've seen this at churches, where, oh, it's another missionary today, and it's sort of like, oh, they're taking up preaching time, or, oh, we're just going to hear these stories from overseas. But then there's others that we've both experienced, thankfully, that are just thrilled that you're there. I think pastors can get their churches excited. Hey, first time we're going to see this missionary in 5 years or 7 years, whatever the case may be, and make this as a great thing. Like we have the opportunity to hear from our missionary who's not been with us for so long, and build it up with anticipation for the church rather than, oh yeah, we got a missionary tonight. No, let's make this a great thing and build within people the excitement of hearing what God's doing, because there's some great stories of what the Lord is doing. And if I can add to that, I would say, I know in our services we're so crammed for time, and it's sometimes can be frustrating when you say, hey, missionary, give us an update over what's been going on for 4 years, and you give them 4 minutes or 5 minutes to do it. So if you're going to have a guy come in, I would encourage that, hey, give them some time worthy of hearing what they've been doing. Let them expound, because you want to hear what God's doing in the life of individuals, not just the generic, well, over the 4 years we've had so many people saved. Well, those salvation stories equal testimonies of a lot of hard work, both on that missionary and obviously the Holy Spirit, of course. And so, man, let's hear some of those things. Those are stories that are exciting to hear, but sometimes we shortchange the time we give missionaries to talk about them.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more I think that we could talk about as what a church could do to prepare. I would say this one more thing, and then maybe ask what can a missionary do to prepare. I would say, as a pastor, one of the things I tried to do was I try to be very careful about how many new missionaries. When we got to a point where we were supporting a good number of missionaries, and I recognized if I have a new missionary in all these times, what happens when my missionaries I support come back? if I give them an opportunity, I never get an opportunity to preach. And so we began to try to balance that out and say, we're gonna focus on bringing new missionaries in more around missions conference time, and then that would give opportunity to be very flexible in our schedule for those missionaries coming back on furlough, recognizing again that I wanted to give those missionaries a time to not just be back in churches reporting. I know they love that. That's part of what they do. I've never really heard a missionary complain about having to do that. But I recognized I wanted them to have that really structured family rest and relaxation and recuperation time. So just be real flexible. And I was always more flexible in my schedule with a furloughing missionary that we supported as opposed to a new missionary coming in.
Makes perfect sense.
I think we could do that. But let's ask ourselves, we're kind of running out of time here. Let's try to wrap this up with what can a missionary do to make furlough successful on their part?
Well, one thing I would say is for them to plan to spend some time with their sending church.
Yes.
I think that's so important so that they can be ministered to by the people who know them best. They can reconnect with their home base, just like Paul did with the church at Antioch. He and Barnabas came back there, and that's his home turf. Spend some time on your home turf, with the people you know and the people you love. Reconnect with them and allow them to minister to you.
Sure.
Because, missionaries are giving out, as I said earlier. And so when you get back to your church, in a sense, allow them to give to you and invest in you and minister to you.
Yeah.
I think to help fill their love cup can help them go a long way as they continue on furlough.
Yeah, I think the other thing a missionary can do is most missionaries recognize furlough's coming up next year. Don't wait until 3 weeks before you start leaving to start scheduling meetings. Most pastors are scheduling their meetings out a year in advance, or would at least appreciate that there's a better opportunity to get the dates you're looking for. And so plan in advance and say to a pastor, hey, pastor, next year's going to be furlough time for us. Is there a time that you'd like us to come in? Here's the times I'm scheduled to be in your area, and work that way. And so that you can also, that way, I think the more effectively you manage your schedule, the better opportunity there's going to be for you to have that time of rest and relaxation, refreshment that your family is desperately in need of, and that whether you recognize it or not as a missionary, you are as well. Absolutely.
And, to draw this to a conclusion, I just think that I've seen missionaries who wait till they get back to the States because they say, it's easier for me to call and pastors when I'm here in the same time zone, or wow, it's hard if you put so much more pressure on yourself. And yes, I know sometimes, particularly in my region, we're 12, 14, 15 hours ahead of schedule of churches here in the United States, that they got to get up at 3 a.m. and call pastors, and that's not fun. But it's worth it to do it then before they get back to the States. Yeah. It just helps out, makes all the difference in the world.
Absolutely. They could always send an email off and try to schedule some times to call, too, and make that time more effective. Boy, I think there's a lot more we could talk about here and could probably continue on with the furlough, but we're going to be over time if we do. And so I hope this conversation on what is furlough, is it biblical, and how does a church help a missionary during furlough time, and how does the missionary make his furlough successful? I hope that's a help and encouragement to those who have been listening. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast, Conversations on the Commission. We look forward to connecting with you next time.
You can download, share, and subscribe at all your favorite podcast spots like iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everything else. Look for us there. And our emails are found in the show notes, but you can email us at seadirector@bimi.org or farnorthdirector@bimi.org. We look forward to hearing from you. Send us some suggestions, send us some comments. We'd love to get some feedback from you all.